Thanks, Chelsea. I've got 4 grandchildren. I need to go and have a lie down after I've spent an afternoon with them. I'm not very keen on the word retirement. It's got a French derivation. It means to withdraw. And whenever I hear the word, I think withdraw from what? Now, I'm still working. Apparently, according to the dates that my mother gave me, I'm 71 today, and here I am still working. I think Mum might have messed up the dates or something, because I feel about 42. But I don't like the word retirement. I quite like the idea of retirement, but I think I'm really going to follow in my father's footsteps, who practiced medicine for 60 years and was still practicing medicine a couple of months before he died. And it was good for Dad. He'd get up and he'd toddle off to the hospital with his beanie on and his cardie and such like, and he'd spend a bit of time seeing a few patients and maybe sitting in on some clinical meetings and things like that, and then he'd toddle off back home. And it was fantastic for Dad. It was really good for him. Got him out of the house, kept him reading his Lancets and his British medical journals and so on. I never learned how good it was for the patients, but it was absolutely fantastic for Dad. Just a little disclosure from me. I've got 3 main roles. I do this work for lifetime income, including a directorship, and I've got a small shareholding with the company as well. I do seminar work and write articles for South Bar, monthly articles, and I'm a director and a director of New Zealand Shareholders Association. I wondered how to tackle this session, because I've only got 20 minutes to talk about wills and trusts. And I could easily spend the rest of the week, and I'm serious about that, talking about that. They are very big subjects. And so what I thought I would do was tackle this from the point of view of what I have done. So to really tell my own story, because 4 or 5 years ago, I had a fair old shake-up in my life, which resulted in, amongst other things, moving from Queenstown, which had been my home for 20 years, back to Christchurch. And when you have a big shake-up and big changes in your life, at any point in your life, but particularly a bit older, you really should have a look to see if the things that you are doing financially are still valid and still reasonable. So I went back and had a review of my things, and I was thinking there particularly of my wills and trusts initially, but I had a look more widely at that. And before I started doing this, I set myself some aims, if you like. What was I trying to do in this? And the first aim I had was that I wanted more time, which is a silly thing to say really, because you can't get more time. There's only 24 hours in the day, there's 60 minutes in an hour and so forth. You can't get more time. What you can do is reallocate your time. And what I decided that I wanted to do was to allocate a bit more time to the climbing and mountaineering and things like that I particularly love doing. Now that peak was last year's objective in France. I've decided that I'm going to go to Europe for a month or 2 every year to go climbing. That was last year's objective. This year's objective wasn't quite as spectacular as that, but still quite interesting. And just because I know that not everybody wants to do that sort of thing, I do want to also spend a lot more time with grandchildren, and that's one of the reasons for the change from Queenstown back to Christchurch. This is Jesse. I don't know where he got this 2 hands together to place kick. Maybe channeling his inner Johnny Wilkinson. So I wanted to reallocate time was the first thing. I wanted to simplify my life. I watched both my parents individually simplify their lives and start to give stuff away and that sort of thing. I wanted to be ready for retirement if I was stopped in what I was doing, because we can say, well, I don't want to retire, or I want to retire when I'm 75 or 80 or something, but at any point we can be stopped in what we're doing, whether that's because we're made redundant or because we have some kind of health thing. And so I wanted to be able to just, if I did need to stop paid work, I needed to just flick a switch and I could be retired. And finally, I wanted to help my family, help my children, especially give help to the grandchildren. So the result of this reviewing was really half a dozen different things. The first thing I decided was that I was going to wind up my family trust. Second, to make a new will. Third, do new enduring powers of attorney. Number 4, I ceased to be a financial advisor. So I wrote to the Financial Markets Authority and basically handed in my financial advisor's badge and said, I'm not going to do this anymore. Fifth, I had my investments managed for me after 40 odd years or longer of looking after my own investments. I handed my investments over to other people to manage for me. And number 6, I started a small gifting program. So, come now, first of all, I'm just going to go around each of those 6 things and just give you a little bit more flesh on the bones. First of all, the trust and the will. Now, if you're talking about these kinds of things, you're really talking succession. And William Shakespeare, 500 years ago, had the last word on succession, really about how not to do succession. And he did this in a play called King Lear, for those of you who might remember their 7th form English. The basic plot of King Lear was that King Lear was getting old, wanted to give up being a king, and decided he would share his kingdom amongst his 3 daughters. And he did this on a whim. And so he got the 3 daughters into the throne room and had an absolutely novel, I'd call it ridiculous, approach to succession. And he said to the 3 daughters, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop being king. You're going to look after the kingdom now. I'm going to give you a third each of the kingdom. But before you do this, you need to tell me how much you love me. What an approach to succession. So the 2 older girls wax lyrical. You know, we will love you forever, dearest father. It's wonderful. But the younger one, Cordelia, said, Father, and she was the one who actually loved them the most, but said, Father, I love you as much as nature should. You know, I'm your daughter, you're my father, I love you as a daughter should love a father. So that enraged King Lear, as you can see on the screen. And what he did was he banished Cordelia and did a deal with the 2 older daughters where they each got half the kingdom. And King Lear could go about, sort of month about with each of the older daughters. The older daughters end up completely reneging on that deal. Everybody went off to a fairly early death, and a particularly miserable death in just about every case. About the only one who didn't die in the play had his eyes gouged out. The play is called a tragedy for good reason, because people so often get this succession wrong. When we look at family trusts, we should always be doing, or if you have settled a trust yourself, we should always be doing, both before we set the trust up and during the life of the trust, a weighing exercise. It's a weigh-in. And we're really weighing, on the one hand, the benefits that might accrue to a trust from having a trust against the disadvantages having a trust. Now, when I looked at this, I'd settled the trust in either 1988 or 89, so the trust had been going for a fairly long time. I'd done it because I was going into business. There were risks in that business. I was giving, part of that was that I was doing a lot of financial advice. So I wanted my lifestyle assets to be in the trust, protected for the family if I should do something even more stupid than what I'm accustomed to doing. So that was why I did, and that was gone for me. I just resigned as a financial advisor. I wasn't doing anything particularly risky at all. So the benefit of the trust for me was pretty well nil. Now, that may not be the case for you. You may be getting some kind of tax relief from the trust. You may be thinking that you may still be able to get a rest home subsidy by having the trust. There's a few people have used family trusts as the coward's prenuptial agreement. So instead of with a new partner saying we need to sign all these documents that I've had the lawyer draw up, and it's called a prenuptial agreement, instead of having that rather awkward conversation, the idea is that if you put assets aside in the trust, they can't be divided in the case of a relationship breakup. So look very carefully at what benefits you're getting from the trust, and then you've got to weigh that against the cost. And the cost isn't really in a couple of main areas. There's obviously a monetary cost, and that monetary cost is going higher because of the Trusts Act. And that means that any lawyer or accountant who's involved in a trust is likely to be charging you more. So there's a monetary cost, but there's also a cost in terms of complication. It's another entity that you have to manage, and you do have to manage that extremely well. So that weighing is a part of it. And for me, and why I decided to wind up the trust, was that I was getting no real benefit from the trust I'd settled, and I did have significant costs. If you do wind up the trust, then in my case at least, the assets come back to me. And that means that my position is different, and that my asset position is different, and therefore my will needs to be different. So wind up the trust, you're almost certainly going to have to do a new will, which is what I did. And when I did a new will, I had three main classes of beneficiaries. First of all, I had a couple of charities that I had a long-term relationship with, and so I left a relatively small amount of money to them. Second was the grandchildren. I wanted to benefit the grandchildren on the basis that the earlier they have some money, and this is only after I die, obviously, because it's with the will, but the earlier they have the money, the way compound interest works, the more that they will have. So I was keen to leave in my will each of the four grandchildren an amount of money. The problem is, if I gave Gabby, who's age 2, an amount of money in my will, and she got that amount of money, the only real beneficiary would be Toys R Us, who would be absolutely delighted with Gabby coming in with X thousands of dollars to spend it. And there's a real problem in doing this, because without setting up another trust for them and jumping through an awful lot of hoops, it's quite difficult to do this. There is a fairly neat solution which works for most people, not everybody, but for most people, and that is KiwiSaver. So what I have done is, yes, I've left significant amounts of money for each of the grandchildren, but have stipulated that it has to go into their KiwiSaver accounts. And that's not being mean and miserable and saying, and you're not going to get any of your hands on this until you're 65 years old. Instead, that money represents a fair step towards their first home. So it's really a fair bit of the money towards a deposit for their first home. So that's the wills and the trust. I did enduring powers of attorney as well. Well, that's one for my personal care and one for property or finance. They are reasonably straightforward. The next thing I did was cease to be a financial advisor, and that really has been my main bit of work for the last 20 or even 25 years. So it was quite a wrench doing that, because yes, I could probably even now get my license back, but I would have to do a fair bit of work to be able to do that. And I enjoyed that, and as I say, it was a big part of who I am and what I am. And I have a lot of friends who like sort of poking at me a bit, and you know, they would say, well, you know, there you are still working, why are you still working, and so forth. I take some comfort from the fact that the lady on the screen in this respect is worse than I am. Because at the time, apparently, that this photo was taken, she was 102. And she, at that time, worked 70 hours a week in her dry cleaning shop. So even I'm not that bad. But I have ceased to be a financial advisor, and that's freed up a fair bit of time, and it's also freed up a fair bit of space of mind. The next thing I did was to think about my investments and how I was managing those. And I think I made my first share investments when I was in my early to mid-20s. I'd guess at about age 24 or 26 or something like that. And ever since then, I have been managing my own investments. And of course, I think of myself as an investment genius. And when we're thinking 4 or 5 years ago that I was looking at this, and I was getting fantastic returns. Clearly, that's proof I was an investment genius. However, I am fair-minded, and I did realise that 4 or 5 years ago, everybody was getting really good returns. Markets were going up. So I decided to compare my performance against other comparable funds and people. How was I doing against others? So I looked at all the balanced funds. I was running my money at the time as a balanced investor. So I looked at the balanced fund, and I looked at what other financial advisors who were managing money, what returns they were getting. So rather than being a genius, I wasn't. Now, I'm delighted to say I wasn't a dunce either, but I was sort of messing in the middle. I was about average. So I was jumping through a lot of hoops. I was going through a lot of difficulty. I had this personal money management was taking up even more of my space of mind. And I dug deep to find out, why was this happening? Why was I only average? Because I thought I had all the skills and I had all the knowledge, and I've got some really good contacts. I should be getting better than that. And the reason was I've always had multiple roles, and I wasn't giving my investments my best time. My best time is in the morning, and I was looking after my money after I'd done a day's work, had dinner, had a glass of wine, and then I'd stagger upstairs to the office to have a look and see if I could do something about my investments. At my very worst time, 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, instead of at 9:30 in the morning. But the other reason is that although I'm a reasonably good buyer of investments, I'm a lousy seller. I get, and I've written about this, I get emotionally attached to my investments. So I buy them and I ride them up, and then I ride them all the way back down again. And I don't tend to sell because I'm emotionally attached. So I've given my investments to a couple of professionals, a couple of financial advisors. They manage my money for me, and if I put these two things together, the management of my money and being a financial advisor, that's taken a lot of load off me. Final thing I've done is I have started gifting, and I gift to the 4 grandchildren by way of putting money into their KiwiSaver on a weekly basis, gift to 1 or 2 other family members who need a bit of help. I have started quite small in this because I'm not sure, have I got enough money? We've all got that insecurity, is the money going to last? Well, I've got some fairly good expertise on that, but even I have a bit of nervousness. Will the money last as long as I do? But I will increase that gifting to children and grandchildren as time goes on. Final thing to talk about is the things that I haven't yet done, and there are basically 3 of them. First of all, I haven't sorted out my digital, I'll get my tongue around it, digital legacy yet. What am I going to do with the password to my Facebook page, my bank account passwords and those things. Now there are ways and means of doing these. I haven't figured them out completely yet, but that's something I still have to do. Second that I've got to do is the family photos. I've got family photos that go back over 100 years of my parents, my grandparents and so forth. And I've got one lot in a book, and they're all labelled, and it says who they are and so forth, so that future generations will know about the stuff. But the rest of them are an absolute mess. There are boxes and boxes of photos in no particular year and no particular order. And if you looked at these boxes, you would scratch your head and say, well, that's just like a rat's nest, basically, just a horrible mess. What I have on my phone in terms of photos and what I have on my computer in terms of photos are even worse. And I need to sit down and sort those. And the last thing that I want to do is to get down in writing some of the old family stories that my mother, my father, my grandparents used to tell us, so that we have them down in writing again for future generations. I want to tell a few of my own story. I'm not going to write, and even if I did, I would not publish my memoirs, but I do want some of the things that had happened, some of the stories and so forth, to be down in writing for good. And the reason for this is that money is not the only legacy. So we have legacies in terms of what we think, what we feel, which are likely to be passed down, or could be passed down the generations just as well with the money. So I leave you with the idea of that money is not the only legacy. Thanks very much.